Welcome back to the Bible in Context.
Where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
And apparently I am very inept on my knowledge of semi-recent history.
We forgot how young Caleb is.
Or how
He is wise beyond his years, though, so we're thankful for that.
Well, thank you. All right, back to Galatians. Let's finish out the book of Galatians. We've talked about chapters 1 through 6, and this episode we want to recap and just go over some broad, high-level themes that we saw in Galatians and some practical application. Why, as 21st century Christians, do we want to read this book? So, Aaron, why should we read this book?
Gosh. Well, of course, the usual way of answering that question would be something about, well, we care about salvation, and Galatians is about salvation, of course, and so we should study Galatians for the doctrinal theology that we can suck out of it, which I think we've discovered is a little bit off the topic and misses the opportunity to see what Galatians is really about. In its first century context, Galatians is about not distorting the Christian life after salvation, not distorting the Christian life with theological components that are going to interrupt God's grace that defines Christian life. And for the first century people, that was dealing with, of course, an injection of certain aspects of Torah observance back into the Christian life. But that principle is applied to our 21st century context of we do not want to distort the Christian life by theologically injecting elements into the Christian, the very, very basis and sort of genetics of the Christian life that would make it not be the Christian life anymore. Not just first century Torah observance issues, but any other kinds of issues that might serve that disruptive function.
So what do you think some common distortions that we see today?
You know, it varies. Culture, if we just talk about American evangelical culture, it varies subculture to subculture. Like back in the 50s, maybe in Texas, Buddy Holly faced the idea that you can't be Christian and write rock and roll music, right?
Right.
Or there's that old joke, what Baptists are afraid of sex because it might lead to dancing, you know, or we don't play cards, you know, you can do anything, you can do X, Y, Z, but you can't play cards in this congregation. But then it can also be things like, well, now that you're a Christian, let me tell you how to be a real Christian. Real Christians, ... you know, they believe in Arminianism, or they believe in Calvinism, or they believe in infant baptism, or they believe in believer baptism, or they don't think that you should be able to get divorced and remarried, or they think that real Christians think that women can be elders, or real Christians think that women can't be elders. Now, for any of those issues, some of them are more central and important, and especially the central and important ones will have correct and good theological positions on them. But to elevate them to, if you want to be a Christian, or in our church, or to be a real Christian, you have to not just be in relationship with God and accept His grace. You have to also not play cards, or not believe this doctrine, or do believe that doctrine, or vote this political party. Anytime you elevate those things to the level of you have to do them to be a real Christian, then you're violating what Paul has to say in Galatians.
Yeah, and I feel like this is applicable on two fronts. On the one front, you have maybe someone who is in the situation of being told, like, there's this tertiary or secondary issue that you have to be considered part of the church, part of Christianity. And so they need to, again, this is tricky, but because you have to have people you trust around you who are very well in tune with what the gospel is, so that you can critically evaluate that and say, like, okay, look, my loyalty is to Christ. That's what matters. On the other side, you may have those who are kind of setting those boundaries of these are things that we deem these are outside of the community bounds. And so there are certain things like, yes, if someone is committing adultery on a regular basis and they have they're not repentant whatsoever, then yeah, that's something where it's like, yes, you were living outside the community bounds, and that is something that is making you no longer loyal to Christ. However, we need to be humble on secondary issues and secondary theological topics and say that these are not issues of disloyalty to Christ. And so we can't make these things what we kick them out of our church over.
You're right. That's a good way of disambiguating part of what I said. And you also raised a second issue that points out I was a little unclear and need to be give some more clarification.
No, I think what you said was good. I'm just thinking of more examples and situations turning through my head and how to resolve those, because this gets very practical.
It gets practical, but you don't want to start overlapping issues in a sense, where Paul says, where you gave the example of what if somebody is regularly committing adultery? Is that a disciplinary issue? Elsewhere, Paul would say, yeah, here's how you conduct church discipline, and here's how you judge good theology. But that's not what he's talking about in Galatians. I just want to make it clear that,
right.
Or pick another example like, I deny the divinity of Jesus. Well, that's bad theology, and you can say you are theologically incorrect. And if you teach that in our church, then you're going to be not allowed to speak in Bible studies because, that's not something that we want taught in our church. Those are sort of like theological issues or pastoral issues or church discipline issues, not what Paul's talking about in Galatians. So Paul would agree, oh yeah, you can't go around denying the divinity of Jesus, but that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is where there's a bunch of happy-go-lucky Christians who are living out their lives because they're living out a Christian life, which means they are in relationship with God and Jesus. They have a trust-based relationship and intimacy with Jesus, and they experience the power of the Spirit, and that is God's grace in their life, and they live day by day that relationship that defines their identity as a reception and expression of God's grace in their life. And if anybody comes in and says, I'm going to add something to that grace as the other half, it's grace plus that, then Paul's going to say, wait, no, that's not fundamental to your identity. Yes, believing Jesus' divinity is fundamental to Christian theology, but I'm not talking about Christian theology over here or church discipline issues. I'm talking about over here when somebody invades and says, I'm going to challenge your very identity and I'm going to derail your very intimate trust-based relationship with Jesus. Paul says, I will not allow somebody to come in and derail my beloved Galatians' relationship with Jesus.
Right. And I feel like something that would, I feel like this kind of puts a point on it too, or a different point on it. If there's something that, let's say someone has in their life, whether it's, they have tattoos, or, they like to go play cards, or they're okay with a moderate amount of alcohol, things that are secondary issues. If you wouldn't say you are no longer a Christian, then you should also not say that you can't be at this church. Because being part of the kingdom community, that is, being part of the kingdom, being part of God's church, we should not be splitting and separating and being disunified over these secondary issues in any respect.
Yeah, that's possibly true. And that would be an implication of some of the community reconciling comments that Paul gives in chapters 5 and 6. I think, though, for the very good principle that you're outlining, you'd want to look more directly at places like 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, right? Or
yeah, for sure. I'm tying big things together, not staying
germane
just to
together,
Galatians.
But you're aptly demonstrating how the principles in Galatians tie into those other principles, and together they weave together a big whole that Paul would endorse as this is what the Christian community should look like in terms of how they edify one another.
Yeah, which that's what in all of his letters, that's typically what, except for maybe a couple you would say, he's trying to do is hold together broken communities of flawed people who are trying to maintain their loyalties to Christ and are suffering in different ways. And so there's a lot of overlap that we should be looking for, I think, in his intentions in his letters.
That's right. It's just that he ends up deep diving into a topic because of the occasion in one particular context. And then you realize that his intention, like if you pan out, is the same, even though he's having to specifically address each of those occasions on an ad hoc basis.
Right. So something that I want to go back and actually ask you about that you mentioned at first that I think is a really good point that may make some uncomfortable depending on their background. And that is the fact that Galatians is not primarily about introducing the step-by-step process of salvation or the gospel. And so if you're taking the gospel as far as Galatians being a primer for the gospel or being a step-by-step of the gospel, then you're removing Jesus from Galatians a little bit. We're kind of detracting from the worth of this letter, right? Is that what we're doing? Because we need to, that's something that is taught in a lot of places where you need to bring your sermon, even you bring your sermons back around to the gospel explicitly every time. And there's good principles behind that. I'm not arguing against that. But do you understand the kind of the place I'm coming from and asking that question?
Yeah. And I don't want to step on the toes of any well-meaning pastors out there, but I would say maybe not every sermon needs to come down to this particular passage embeds in it an altar call. I think every sermon can have an altar call at the end, but you shouldn't always necessarily say, oh, this passage or this book is about salvation, and so I'm going to end my sermon by boiling down this book to a message of salvation. I think it's great to invite people to surrender their lives to Jesus at every opportunity, but I think that, hopefully again, not stepping on pastoral toes here, I think that the gospel is a bigger word than sometimes we give it credit for. It does mean initial salvation and surrender to Jesus' lordship. But then it also means the flourishing of life in the kingdom as somebody who is living out a surrendered life to Jesus in an ongoing basis. Like, the gospel doesn't end with somebody's conversion. It sort of begins with somebody's conversion. And so I think you can preach through Galatians and say, Galatians is talking about the richness of life according to the Spirit. And that is part of the gospel. That is kingdom language stuff. And if you want to, invite somebody to an altar call moment, a conversion, surrender your life to Jesus moment. You can say, if you would like to start working towards the kind of life that Paul is describing, the Galatians have experienced and should continue to pursue when they reject the agitators, then it starts with something that Paul isn't actually talking about in this letter. It talks about something that predates this letter where the Galatians had already been saved. And if you want to work up to where the Galatians are invited to explore and celebrate and participate in that life, then let's go backwards a step to the initial thing that you have to do. So I think that I'm not stealing Jesus and the gospel out of Galatians. I hope that I'm saying that Galatians is amplifying the way that we use the word gospel and gives you another tool in your belt to invite people to surrendering their lives to Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Paul is assuming if you want to talk about that beginning of the gospel, he's assuming that and then showing how do we live after that.
Yeah, that's the issue of contention between the agitators and Paul in Galatians. And so you're right, that is what he's showing about how they ought to live, given that they've already been saved before the letter was written.
So, Aaron, what would be 3 takeaways for us as modern people to take away from the book of Galatians?
Well, I think that the takeaways for us are kind of the same as the takeaways for the first century audience of the churches of Galatia. I mean, they were dealing with this particular group of agitators that were particularly trying to use a certain theology to ruin their Christian life, but the idea of the Christian life being ruined in different ways, or the importance of all this, I think those are the key takeaways for us. So maybe I'd say the first, not in any particular order, but since we ended chapter 6 talking about Paul's case study, this is what you guys ought to do communally to get away from life according to the flesh and back to life according to the Spirit. The first key takeaway would be theology and Bible interpretation really do matter. Like, even in the first century, correct theology of the Christian life with Paul's help really do matter, because we saw that bad theology turned the Galatians into people who were vainglorious. They had nothing to boast about, but they were still boasting. They were neglecting one another. They were devouring one another. They were severing themselves from Christ. And their community was falling apart, which didn't make sense. If they were following the correct theology according to the agitators, shouldn't they have better results than this? And no, the answer is bad theology turns into bad individual Christian living, and that's destructive to God's community of faith. And it's God's, so you want to be very reverent about destroying God's community of faith. So maybe that's a first takeaway to think about.
Yeah, Aaron, it's a helpful point, though, just the need for like theology and how we read the Bible and in its context, as we say often on this podcast, is so important. It's so Gosh, like you said, and I can't remember if you said this while we were recording or it might have been one between sessions, but you recognize Galatians as a masterpiece when you but you had to tilt your head a little bit to see it. And I'm assuming what you're meaning is like to see it through the eyes of the first century original audience, and it makes all the difference in the world. And how vital is it for us today? And I see this throughout the church, and it's evident in our church even today. I mean, I think we, especially if you grew up in the Western culture, you almost have to have a little bit of church detox in a sense, because there's so many things that we grew up with that were additions to the gospel that were expected in our Christian lives. And so, yeah, I agree. That's a key point for us to take away from this.
Great.
Well,
Thanks.
and Paul emphasizes church unity so much that, this theme of not breaking down the kingdom and not distorting it, not using it to your own selfish advantage, I think that is a massive implication that, really we need to hear in a lot of places in the church.
Right. To the degree that Paul hints at talking about individual piety in Galatians, he's talking about it because of it's important for the community.
Right. So what else can we take as 21st century Christians from the book of Galatians?
Well, when they just said connecting that point about, bad theology being destructive to God's community of faith, tied to the adding stuff to the gospel, that leads into the second point. We've already said this several times, but it's one of the other key takeaways, I think, for 21st century Christians is you can't have a grace plus version of Christian identity of the Christian life. And Caleb, we just finished talking a few moments ago about, you can't continuously live in an adulterous way, or you can't deny the divinity of Jesus. But that's about, Christian ethics and good theology and all of those things. Those are important. Paul wouldn't deny that. But when somebody comes in, to repeat what we've already said, when somebody comes in and says, being a Christian means accepting God's grace and being in an intimate, trusting relationship with Jesus plus this, then they're going to have a ruining version of what being a Christian means. It's going to, Paul says in Galatians, if you say grace and intimacy with God plus Torah observance, then that pushes out grace and intimacy as God, and all that's left is Torah observance. So the plus is all that is left if you add a plus. And so the specific plus that the first century Galatians were dealing with might not be our plus, but as we've said many times now, the thing for us to pull out for the 21st century is, yes, disclaimer, there's good theology, there's good Christian practice, there's all those things, but knowing that being a Christian means receiving and living out God's grace of an intimate personal relationship with Jesus, period. That's what being a Christian is. That. Not that plus anything, just that. And that's an important thing for us to take away from Galatians to make sure that there's no plus added to that.
Right. Yeah, I was just having a conversation tonight actually with somebody who at times struggles with, like, am I going to hell or not? And try to encourage them that one, and I can't remember where I've heard this. I've heard it numerous times, but like your good works didn't earn your salvation, and your failure to do good works is not going to take it away. And he's said this numerous times to me, but it's like a marriage. It's a covenant relationship, and so as long as your heart is to be faithful to Christ, you're not going to be perfect, and you're gonna make mistakes. And so it's like you said, it's about an intimate relationship with the Savior, and that's it, period. So
yeah, where do your loyalties lie?
Yeah, where do your loyalties lie?
So maybe the third thing, and these aren't the only three things, but a third thing that we could extrapolate out from Galatians for our 21st century context is what it meant to live the life of the Spirit for the Galatians. And remember, several sessions ago, Paul started off in chapter 3 saying, you guys were already living the life with the Spirit, and now you're going backwards to try and go back forwards to get to where you already are again. How stupid is that? So he doesn't argue for any of this stuff. He references their experience, which is common knowledge to everybody in the debate and the conversation. And this is where Galatians might, be a little bit alarming to people depending on their background of theological stripe. But it seems like the way that Paul talks of the Galatians experience, and then the way he talks about, especially in that second part of his argumentation in 4:21 through 6:10, he says, living as God's heirs has to do with living out the life of his Spirit. Well, it seems like Paul and the Galatians are all on the same page in presuming that there is a degree of charismatic something or other in the theology of the Christian life, according to the New Testament canon. And Paul talks interchangeably in different places about the Spirit being both God and Jesus' personal divine presence in human history, the expected eschatological coming of God's presence into the life of the kingdom and his people. And so the way Paul explains things in especially the second portion of his argumentation in this particular letter, is that the Spirit empowers believers to live as Jesus replicas, and therefore to be fellow heirs along with Jesus of God's. So the way that Paul is kind of like approaching his argumentation in chunks of this letter are to say that any attempt to live the Christian life by way of something other than the Spirit is not actually the Christian life. And I don't know how that has to look in a given context. I'm not going to start prescribing what different denominations should start doing. I'm just saying the Spirit isn't quiescent. It's not just the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the... It really is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that is an experienced historical reality, not a conceptual nod that Christians give in their theology. And any Christian theology that doesn't really acknowledge and find room for that expression won't fit with what Paul is presuming to be true in Galatians in some way.
So I wonder, too, if the reverse is true, because I feel like this is a question that comes up a lot as well, is people wondering, well, without some sort of what we would consider maybe, more charismatic signs in someone's life today, do I actually have the Spirit? And so do you think Paul would say as well that, well, if you are showing that you care for Christ's community out of loyalty to him, then that is a Spirit-proving sign in your life?
Yeah, that's what he says in this letter in chapter 5, verse 13 through 6:10. He says, if you're living a cruciform life, if you're living a life that is guided by the Spirit, if you're living a life where your relationships or the way you relate to fellow believers in your particular local community are characterized by peacefulness and gentleness and kindness and patience, then you're doing that by the Spirit. So I don't know about Galatians doesn't refer to what some people sometimes talk about as more visible or kind of ecstatic signs of the Spirit. Galatians is talking about if you're living this way, it's not because of your innate wonderfulness as a Galatian. It's because you're a Spirit person who's being guided by the Spirit. So that's what that looks like in this letter, and it's pretty low key in that sense. It's not a very demanding, scary bar to try and measure up to theologically.
So Spirit living is walking in step with the tradition of Jesus that Paul has given to them.
Well, not just walking in step. I think there's an element of empowerment. That's what Paul refers to repeatedly in the letter that's part of the Galatians already experienced, like in 3:1 to 7. It's not just adhering to a certain standard. It's actually living that out. And I think that's where that's another place that Paul has the agitators up against the ropes. The agitators claim, and you follow our version of theology, then you really will live in a way that God will find approving. And Paul is watering down the gospel by chopping those things out. And he's offering you an easy way out. And Paul says, no, I'm offering you the much harder way of actually living in a way that looks like Jesus. And that can only happen by the Spirit of Jesus being in your midst and being in you personally, being the person that you are relating with when you're relating to Jesus, to God and Jesus. So Paul says, Paul's not saying Paul's denying the charge that he's making the Christian life easier than the more rigorous version of the agitators. Paul says, the agitators say you just have to check these boxes. I'm saying you actually have to live by the Spirit and do it routinely and not do it by your own power, but rely on the grace of God's empowerment.
No, that's good.
So what I'm
it's
hearing is it's not grace plus Torah following. It's grace plus speaking in tongues.
Right. No, it's grace, which is going to have its natural outflow of actually living a life that looks like somebody who's been transformed by grace.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. No, I appreciate what you're saying and clarifying what you mean by charismatic, because that word charismatic gets thrown around a lot and means different things. Here in Kentucky, especially in the county that we live in, it can mean a much different thing than just simply like what you're talking about, being able to live with the fruit of the Spirit in your life and under the leadership and the guidance of the Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah. Try producing that fruit without the leadership and guidance of the Spirit.
Exactly.
And I was reflecting I think off mic at some point I was reflecting with Caleb. I had a little bit of a realization for myself here that the casual way that Paul is referring to the history of the Galatians with them when he's talking with them kind of gets all sides of the modern debate on this. Because typically I've moved around a lot, so I've been part of churches that are from different denominations, and I would say that to kind of take some cheap shots, I admit, but as caricatures for the point of illustration, in your very Reformed traditions, they will say something like, often, good theology is super duper duper important, and we've kind of graduated past the need for sort of spiritual things because we have distilled spirituality down to good theology. And sometimes you might get into charismatic contexts where they sneer at that a little bit and they say, you end at theology and we kick off beyond that. We go to the next level where we don't even need theology anymore because now we have spirit. We're spiritual. We're going to charismatic gifts, and we leave your mere theology far behind.
Right.
And actually, neither one of those is what happened for the Galatians that Paul casually refers to. What they had was Paul comes to them, and the Spirit works among them powerfully, and they convert to being God's people in the middle of Asia Minor. A bunch of non-Jews become God's people in the middle of Asia Minor because of the amazing, exciting, empowering experience of the Spirit and spiritual experiences that they've had that Paul refers to around 3:2 or 3:3. And then they want to know what it means and how to make sense of it and how to actually organize it in their thoughts and then in their lives. And so they say, Paul, we've started with the Spirit. We need you now to give us theology. And so Paul steps in and he gives them theology, gives them structure so they can actually properly live out this Christian calling that they're now part of. So the Reformed people are wrong that you can abandon spirituality for theology. And my caricature of the charismatic people are wrong where you say you graduate from theology to spirit. The real history for Paul is, no, you will have this amazing, overwhelming presence of the Spirit that then has to be organized and given meaningfulness by theology. And that's where the apostles came in to fill in those gaps. That's why they were so vulnerable to the agitators, because they didn't yet have the theology that Paul was providing in this letter. So any version of we think we got a handle on how to do the Spirit or ignore the Spirit in modern evangelicalism probably runs afoul of Galatians in one way or another.
Yeah.
That's good.
Do you think that the American church in general has lost sight of the potential power of the Holy Spirit to, I guess, in evangelism? Like you said, I mean, it seems like the Galatian church was, I don't know if I want to say converted, but they were at least blown away by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And I feel like much of our evangelistic strategies very much lack any kind of spirit empowerment. And this is something I mentioned this on Sunday when I was preaching, that been reading through Acts, and like the filling of the Spirit is almost always in the book of Acts used for emboldening the witness. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like we're missing the mark there.
Well, I know that we can't control the Spirit. we can faithfully proclaim the word, and we can testify to the transformative power of the word in our lives, and then hope the Spirit meets people or does something amazing, moves a mountain or blows somebody away. Not in connection with Galatians, but I learned Galatians from one of my mentors, Gordon Fee, and I was having coffee with him many years ago, and I asked him, because he's Pentecostal, and I asked him, how come you don't speak in tongues at our chapel every Tuesday? And he said, well, different contexts call for different care of the community of faith, and it would be sort of out of place in this particular chapel. People wouldn't know what to do with it. But he says, but sometimes when I'm in such and such context on a missions trip, then it's very normal and free. And I've talked with, so I went and compared notes with a friend of mine who, she's very international. She's sort of first generation immigrant from an African area of the world. And she said, oh yeah, this is very, very uncommon in America, but let me tell you about the kinds of things I see routinely on Sunday mornings when I go to church and when I'm visiting my family back in my parents' homeland. And this is where, all sorts of interesting things like homiletics and missiology come into play, things that I don't have expertise in, but my anecdotal experience talking about these kinds of things with people is that God accommodates different cultures of Christians or would-be Christians in different parts of the world in ways that fits culturally comprehensible ways of meeting them differently. And I pray for something to happen in America where the Western culture would be shocked out of its sort of psychological navel-gazing into an acknowledgement of the spiritual reality of everything. But maybe that won't happen because it would be counterproductive. I'll just rely on God to, create a revival in his own way in each individual culture around the world. That's sort of my anecdotal experience of things. So I don't know that you have to force an issue or emphasize a certain doctrine or cram a certain biblical principle down somebody's throat in order to evangelize them in a given North American evangelical or mission or evangelistic setting.
A lot of wisdom in what you just said. I appreciate that.
Yeah, same here.
Thanks, and I would hope that as the experienced pastor that you would be able to say, oh, you know what? I can speak to that. I can say this works in this kind of evangelistic setting. That works in that kind of evangelistic setting. And that people who are trained and paid pastors would be sensitive to those kinds of contextual issues in ways that I probably am ignorant of.
It's super helpful to think about just every context is different, and every context has a subculture even within that. And we often, I do wish that we would see some more unity within the church, and I'm just thinking my own context right now, where we have a pretty large diversity of, subcultures within the church where we're at, and definitely contrasting expressions of the Spirit with, like, if you walk into from one church to the next.
And often that'll cause rub between those members of different denominations, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I've seen that experience too, but as a Bible nerd, I take kind of solace in the idea that, if we just go back to Galatians, maybe we'll all get a little bit corrected, and we'll sort of abandon the things that are causing us to rub up against each other, and we'll both say, ooh, I should be more in tune with what Paul's saying here.
Well, I'm hoping that with this study, we're taking a step in helping people do exactly that, and just prayerfully hoping to see that we need to not have the gospel plus things. We need to rely on the Spirit as we seek unity and seek representing Christ to others and bringing them into God's people. Aaron, this has been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed having it. I think this has been really helpful. It's helped me see Galatians more clearly and definitely improved upon the notes that I took, years ago as one of my first translation things, and really enjoyed your translation and mini commentary that you wrote. Any plans with that?
I got to figure out how to shop it around and what format it should take. I can always copy and paste parts into different orders. I got to figure out, hey, is there any publisher out there who wants to sit down and have coffee with me? And somebody who needs to guide me through that, because I think it's been a great learning experience for me that I would love other people to have the same positive experience. So I have plans in the sense that I'd like to do something, but I don't know what or how yet.
Okay. Well, we'll say that's to be determined, and if something ever rolls around, we'll make sure to make an announcement about that, because I think it would be great. I enjoyed reading your Targum.
Yeah, right. Thanks.
It's been really helpful. But yeah, this conversation has been great, and I'm hoping that for those of you listening, this has been a helpful conversation to not only understand this confusing book, but also just to see how it very practically fits into your church setting and in your life and your trust in Christ. So, Aaron, thanks again for coming on and taking so much time to walk us through this book and just give some really good exegesis to this confusing letter that Paul has written.
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation and for helping me get it straight in my mind, being able to talk through it again with you.
I think this has been all you, but you're welcome.
Yeah,
it's been good.
Appreciate it.